Here we go. We're in the middle of the first letter, just to take a moment to reset the table before we move forward. In this letter, the Alter Rebbe is speaking about the idea of emunah. And as we have talked about so often, emunah is not just a sort of yes, no, either you have it or you don't. And it's not just sort of a box check to say, yes, I believe in God. Now let's move on. It is a developed, nuanced, enriched passion to be aligned with the infinity of Hashem. As we have talked about, the word emunah, although we simply translate it as belief or faith, it truly means to be an expert in something. An uman is an expert craftsman. That is a developed skill, as opposed to, do you believe it's going to rain tomorrow, which is speculation, or you accept the logic of it. Everybody tells me there's a planet called Saturn, so I accept it as factual. But emunah here in our discussion is about, again, a developed, nuanced subtlety, expertise, and so forth. So we are working off as a sort of framework in the Eishes Chayil, which we're going to revisit a few more aspects of it. And one in particular is Chagra bi'oiz masneha. She literally translates, she girds herself with strength. And the idea is that just as the body is planted, it is firmly rooted on the thigh, so the person is not knocked over, they don't fall down. So too, emunah is based on, it is supported by this, or I'm sorry, our entire relationship with Hashem is supported by emunah, which are described as masneha. Again, the thighs, this sort of idea that the person is standing strong and firm and not going to just fall down. So what's going to prevent us in our relationship with Hashem from falling down when it gets some pushback? That's this quality of emunah. So we'll keep those images in mind, and we'll see that they'll be revisited as we move forward. So we are up to, it is the chitas for either the 4th or 8th of Av, depending on which print you have, in the middle of the first letter of Iggeres HaKodesh. And we gave a little bit of the history that this letter was actually written in different parts, and this piece that we're about to start now was written about a year and a half after the earlier part that was written until that we read until now, and they were combined together by the Alter Rebbe's sons and put into the Prince of Tanya after his death in 1812. So here we go. Ach, however, and as we have talked about before, whenever we see that word ach, and you can see it in the layout of the page, if you have this print of the Tanya, it's a real harsh break. It's offset, and that's deliberate. That means this is like within the same chapter or letter, this is sort of a departure or a little bit of a different idea. Mihu hanoisen koyach va'oiz. What is it? How is it that we can give strength and resilience, lebechinas masnayim, to the thighs? So again, emunah is the basis of our relationship with Hashem, not academic or intellectual, as we'll talk about in a few lines here, about the limitations of the academic and the intellectual. So this is the sort of trick question that we often fall prey to. Can you convince me that God exists? Can you convince me? Prove it to me. So, of course, the pushback is, well, what would prove it to you? And then once I prove it to you, then what are you going to do about it? But the fundamental flaw of that is that it presumes that intellect is the highest level. When we say highest, we don't just mean best, mean the most intensely personal aspect of our existence, which we will adjust and nuance as we play it out. So can we strengthen our emunah? Can we have a stronger emunah? Or is it just a yes-no? Either you believe it or you don't believe it. Is it a yes-no? And of course, our position is not only that we can strengthen our emunah, but we must strengthen our emunah. And this is similar to the Alter Rebbe's description of the mitzvah of love Hashem and love your neighbor, that this is, we ask the question, how can you command me to love Hashem? You can command me to obey Hashem, but either I love it or I don't love it. And we explain that everybody has an innate love of Hashem because we have a part of Hashem, the chelik alaka mimal mamish, the actual spark of Hashem that is embedded within our identity. And therefore, just as the child has an intuitive love for their parent because that is their origin, so too everybody has an intuitive love of Hashem. It can get buried under the pursuit of material things, under distractions and other temptations and so forth that come our way. And our mission is to develop it, to nuance it, to express it, to make it shine and ring out. Well, a similar sense is associated with our emunah. We have an innate emunah in Hashem, and our job and our responsibility, and if we don't do it, it's likely to be overwhelmed by all the competing forces, is to exercise it and strengthen it and so on. How do we do that? So that it should stand up the head and the arms. And we talked about the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe, where he said that on Simchas Torah, really the Torah itself wants to dance, but the Torah doesn't have the ability to dance, so we become its feet and legs. We become the mechanism to execute God's will. We carry it out to the world. What is that? What is the flesh or outer of our emunah? Who asik, and this is an important word which we'll talk about. It is the engagement and the study of the laws of the oral Torah. Shehi bechinas giloi ratzon ha'elyon diaraisa mechachmahu denafkes, which is the revelation of the will of Hashem, the supernal will as it's called, but it means it's God's will, which we'll talk about. That is in Torah, but Torah is, and I'm going to insert this word here, only, and I'm inserting that word, from Chachma, that it is dispatched from. And I just want to finish this and then we'll come back. Aval, but, Makayra v'sharsha, its origin, that is the Chachma of written Torah, its origin is v'sharsha, and its root, from whence the root flourishes like a tree, from a level that is higher than Chachma. And again, when we say higher, we mean more personal, more absolutely true to my identity, not just better. That's this term called Ratzain Elyon, again translated as the supernal, the higher level, God's will, passion, the root word there being the word for to pursue, ruts, things that we run after, which we'll talk about. And just to finish this thought, like it says, Katsena Ratzain Tatrenu, that the Ratzain is like a crown, a Torah like a crown, Shehi ala moichin shebareish, that is on the head. We'll talk about all of these nuanced details. Ukanoida, like we know, Mimashakosov, that it says, Eishes Chayil Ateres Baila. The woman of valor is the crown of her husband. Okay, a lot of data going on here. Let's break it down line by line. Let's really look at each piece and see what the Alter Rebbe is telling us here. So we begin with the premise, the masnayim, the thighs that stand up the whole structure, and that is Amunah. And Amunah, again, doesn't just mean that I acknowledge that God exists. It means that I understand what that means and I experience it. I a little bit just fell into the trap myself by using the word understand, which we'll get beyond that. It penetrates the very entity of my existence. And then we say that we have the capacity and the obligation, like we talked about, to nourish it and develop it. And again, like we said, with loving Hashem, there's an innate instinct of love, and our objective and mission and obligation is to fan those flames, to develop them, to give them depth and breadth and nuance and specificity and so on. And what is the mechanism through which we are able to do that is the study of halacha. Now, here it may seem to be almost oppositional or certainly parallel and different. How is it that this great passionate desire and love and a belief in Hashem is manifest in understanding the nuances of how to check your broccoli for bugs? The disparity seems so stark, so much so, and again, maybe you've observed this in people, they get all excited about their Yiddishkeit, and then they want to come and learn Torah, And it's all about this nuanced detail, this specificity about how a mezuzah must be written, and the matzahs, and lean to the left and don't lean to the left. And there seems to be a major disconnect, and often somewhat of a bit of a disappointment. And this is, in essence, what the Alter Rebbe really wrote Tanya for. Remember, the original audience of Tanya, and it's probably the same today, are people who are doing the mitzvahs. They're not doing the mitzvahs, and yet they're not feeling a sense of closeness or meaning in any relationship with Hashem. They're simply going through the motions. They're doing what they have to do, but they're not sensing that this is feeling any closeness with Hashem. They just feel like they are executing their obligations. They're walking through the steps without there being any sense of intense closeness. So here the Alter Rebbe is saying, okay, we're now going to address Amunah. Oh, wow, this is exactly what I'm looking for. This is what is it? Through the study of halacha specifically, which, again, doesn't always feel like such a Amunah strengthening idea. What is it? Why is it that it's the study of halacha? So for generations, they said, look at the genius. Look how it creates healthy societies. All true. We're in favor of all of that. However, all of those answers are still not addressing the essential core issue. How does this enrich my relationship? We understand how it creates for a more stable society, how it ensures the transmission of Torah teachings for 3,500 years, etc. And here the Alter Rebbe makes the point, because the study of halacha fleshes out the Ratzon of Hashem. And this is the key word of these few lines. So let's back up. First, the sort of technical aspect of it. There is no mitzvah that is self-contained within the written Torah. The written Torah talks about you should write them on the doorposts of your gates, but it doesn't say what they are. What we know as the mezuzah entity, that's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. Exactly how it should be written and what should be written and how the letters should be in a certain shape and form and so on. I think we mentioned this last time. There's no place in the whole Torah that it says, thou shalt not eat on Yom Kippur. It just uses this sort of general term, ta'anu es nafsho seichem. You should deprive yourself. How do we know that that means not to eat and not to drink on Yom Kippur? That's all Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, there's two important understandings of what we mean by the term Torah Sheba'al Peh. To quote the Rambam, who summarizes it, he says that when Hashem gave us the Torah, he gave it also with the mitzvah. That is, he told Moshe the explanation of what these ideas mean. Why didn't he just write it all down? Say, okay, this is what I mean by mezuzah. It's this paragraph, and this is how the letter should be shaped, etc. So there are basically two schools of thought. Both they complement each other. They're not in contradiction. One is it would be endless. It would just be so libraries upon libraries and so on. There was no way. Two, because there's a certain subtlety, there's a certain character that is only transmissible orally. There's just a certain nuance. And this was one of the challenges of writing Tanya, just sort of within that concept. Like, how could you write down such personalized guidance for a person's life? You know, it's hard enough to write an instruction manual as to how to put together a dresser, you know, or how to operate your computer. It's very difficult to write those types of manuals, and everybody just gets all frustrated with them and so on. So imagine you're not just trying to teach people how to put together a train set. You try to teach them about how to have a meaningful relationship with Hashem. It's very difficult. And that's why, again, in the introduction to Tanya, the Alter Rebbe talks about the community rallying around and people sharing their thoughts and not to be inappropriately humble, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the same thing is true, of course, or I would say it begins with the concepts of Torah, that they don't all fit into nice, neat, perfect little algorithms. There is a certain nuance and subtlety that is only transmissible orally. And if you try to write it all down, you're going to be missing something. The unwritten rules are not just because we don't want to write them down, but because it's almost impossible. So that even when Rabbi Yehuda Anasi decided that it was time to write down the Mishnah, and later Rav Ashi, the Gemara, it still retains it. I mean, we still haven't figured it out. The Rambam wrote his book 900 years ago, and he said, if you read this book, this is it. You won't need any other books of halacha. And since that time, more books have been written as commentary on the Rambam than probably on any other major work. So that's, both of those aspects are true. Now, ultimately, what we would add in the sort of chassidus of it is that when Hashem expresses himself, I mean, we know this just in our human experience. When we express ourselves, we can say something and we can make a request for some item, and the person can fulfill it quite literally. And yet there's a certain subtle nuance that we are hopeful for that can't be communicated so directly, either because it is innately so subtle, it is innately so personal, that's probably the better word, that it can't be expressed in words. So herein lies, again, another one of those major issues about Hasidus that some people, I'm talking about Torah people, were skeptical of, not so cool with, et cetera, et cetera. If we make to have the position that the most intense level of our own identity, and therefore we have a tendency to speculate and project that onto Hashem, is our capacity for intellect. We socially revere that. The guy is brilliant. He's a genius. He's got great insight. He's got great retention. He knows the whole Talmud by heart. He has great insight and awareness. Again, we're not against any of that. We're certainly in support of all of that. If we make that the most intense level, then anything that can't be explained, that doesn't fall into that category, is ultimately seen as a little bit less than. So much so that we would say that something that is, and I'll just use the simplistic word stupid, is innately bad. It's immoral if it's stupid. Now, Chassidus introduces, and we have this again in Torah, but there's two different ways that this can be viewed, that something can be higher than rationale. That doesn't make any sense. Has commonly been understood to mean that it's therefore inappropriate. It doesn't make any sense. In other words, it's bad. It should be avoided or at best indulged. But we would hope that one would outgrow it. Chassidus came along and said there's a level called it doesn't make any sense that's higher than logic. That is, it's higher than the intellect. Now, here's where the nuance comes. So some would argue, right, what do you think? You could understand what Hashem wants? You don't understand because Hashem is smarter than you are. Meaning they are still holding on to the idea, that school of thought, that position, again, I'm using the word thought and so on. That perspective is still holding on to the idea that the highest, most personal, most intense, most virtuous character trait is intellect. And it's, okay, you don't understand, but Hashem is higher than you. So you don't understand, but Hashem understands. So I am still acknowledging that, quote, makes sense, just I don't understand it. Just like I don't understand a lot of things. And that is true. Just like the child says, well, why shouldn't I run in the street? And we don't tell him, well, it's because you say, I'm your parent. I understand what you don't understand. And therefore, you should trust that my intellect is greater than your intellect. And the child hopefully does so, but the child will one day grow up and they will understand what the parent understood. But here the Alter Rebbe is, it's not the first time, but here the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing a whole different level. It's not that, well, Hashem is smarter than you, that this is Hashem's ultimate ratzon. And we say, well, why would Hashem want that? So historically, we've said, well, Hashem wants it for this reason and that reason, and we give explanations. Even when we came to the chukim, we said, well, there's a rational idea because we should learn to do discipline. Just like in the military, they may give you some, quote, meaningless task, but they're teaching you to be obedient. You don't understand why there are certain protocols, but without those protocols, there's total breakdown, etc. It always comes down to some sort of verifiable. And this is the issue that the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing here, is that there is a level of closeness with Hashem and the level of the essence of Hashem, the personalized level, which is simply Hashem's ratzon. And that is what is nuanced and developed by Torah Sheba'al Peh. even though Torah Sheba'al Peh operates, the oral law operates on the system of intellect, but ultimately it is drawing out what is truly passionate of Hashem, Hashem's truest passion. So here we see that is the Giloi Rotzein Ha'elyon. It's drawing out what was there all along. Why doesn't Hashem just come right out and say it? So now we have another level of understanding, not just that it would be libraries upon libraries, and not just because there's certain things that can't be communicated. It's because every form of revelation is a form of exposure of self. And to whom do we expose ourselves? People who we trust. As we get a little self-preservational, we're not so anxious to go and expose ourselves. We only to someone who's willing to put in the effort to draw out that aspect of ourselves that we are willing to, I'll use this word, trust. So when Hashem reveals himself at Har Sinai, Hashem is saying, I will trust you that you will not, I'll use this word, abuse or not revere that which I have trusted to you. I think I've told this story before. My late father-in-law, Vashalom, tells a story about how when he shared something that he thought was incredibly personal with a friend of his, and he said, now don't tell anybody. To which his friend would said, well, who would care? Which is it's a little bit of a harsh way of saying it, but that's the, we care. You may think, oh, I don't care, I just shared, right? Because it's so deeply personal, this type of thing. Okay. So what we see is that Chachma is not the wisdom, scholarship, intellect, that whole package is the highest part of our humanity, like the head is above the rest of our body, standing upright, but it's not the most intense, personal, highest, all those good words, expression of Hashem. There's something higher than it. I mean, this is Yira Malka, the reverence of the king, is the concept of the yarmulke, that there's something higher. And this is the idea of a crown, and which the Alter Rebbe makes reference to. This level called the Atara, or we call it commonly the level of Keser. Why does a king wear a crown? It's not just because he needs a hat to keep his head warm. It's because the crown sits on his head, meaning it reminds him that he is subservient to something greater than himself. So the crown is the embodiment of his kingdom, of his family, and everything about him is subservient to the crown, the intellect as well. So his intellect serves his crown. So again, there is a tendency, even call it a philosophy, that everything can be explained logically. And if I don't understand it, next week we'll understand it. Eventually we'll get there. And yet there is a level that the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing, and it makes some people very, as we say, uncomfortable, that it's not because, well, Hashem knows better than you, and Hashem knows what he's doing. There is simply a level that is beyond human or even divine chachma. It's not in the genre of chachma, it's in the genre of rotzai. This leads to an interesting discussion, or it pairs up with an interesting discussion. The Rambam wrote what we call the 13 principles of faith that are summarized in the Ani Maamin. The Ani Maamin is that's a summary. It's a lengthier paragraph form. And one of the 13 principles of faith is that the Torah will never be exchanged. That this is the entirety of Torah, it will never be exchanged. Now, in the Chumash, there is already a commandment that we may not add nor subtract from the mitzvahs. So the commentaries on the Rambam ask the question. We understand, of course, that we cannot add to the Torah and mitzvahs. We cannot come up with a new 614th mitzvah. Yes, we come up with decrees and fences and so on, but we will never come up with another mitzvah, rabbinic mitzvah. So whenever. But why is the Rambam, they argue, why is it that he is insisting that Hashem will never come up with another mitzvah? Why can't it be that Hashem will come out and he'll tell us, however he'll do it, that there's a new mitzvah that Hashem is creating? So they argue so much so, these commentaries on Rambam, that they reject that principle, that this Torah will never be added onto. It won't be added onto by humans, that we understand, but Hashem, he could have come up. What's the pushback? What Chassidus explains, because if we understand that mitzvahs address individual issues, that we happen to go out of Egypt, so therefore Hashem said, okay, let's commemorate going out of Egypt. Let's commemorate Sukkot. There was Yaakov was injured on his sciatic nerve, so let's create the Gid Hanasha. Meaning, if we see mitzvahs as Hashem's ideas, and I don't mean that lightly, so Hashem, I have another idea. Meaning, just like you feed a child milk, and then they get a little older and you give them solids, and then they get a little older and you give them bread, and you get a little older and they eat meat and gummy worms and all kinds of other things. So too, maybe as the world develops, Hashem will have to change the nourishment that we need. So that's their argument. That is, those who disagree with the Rambam, this is the argument they make, that we cannot say that Hashem will never come up with another mitzvah. Again, everyone agrees we can't come up with another mitzvah, so they can't subtract a mitzvah, but they argue that it's not for us to say that Hashem will never come up with another mitzvah. Hashem will come up with whatever he wants. So Chassidus says, no, because it's a misunderstanding. A mitzvah is the Ratzon of Hashem. We don't eat matzah because we left Egypt in such a hurry we didn't have time for the bread to rise. We eat matzah because that is God's will. How do we understand it, etc.? Yes, but ultimately it's because that's God's will. We don't not eat the Gid Hanasha, the sciatic nerve, because Yaakov wrestled with Esau. We don't eat the sciatic nerve because it is the Ratzon of Hashem. Now, this can make people very agitated. Well, it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so it doesn't make any sense. The fact that something doesn't make sense doesn't negate its meaningfulness to Hashem. The Ratzon Hashem, the will of Hashem, doesn't have to conform to intellect. So if we take the perspective that mitzvahs are the ideas that Hashem has, so Hashem has this idea, tomorrow I'll have another idea. And again, that's what they're saying. How could we limit Hashem and say Hashem will never come up with a different idea? That it will be good for us, just like the analogy of the child. You feed an infant milk and you feed an adult solids, because the person changes. The concept is the same. You're providing nourishment, and the nourishment changes depending on the needs of the recipient. Once we understand that it's the Ratzon of Hashem, now we change. Our Ratzon changes. We would essentially argue that our basic Ratzon never changes. But, thank God we're not, what is our Ratzon? We may say, well, I want to have some intellectual pursuit, some financial success, material success. Our basic Ratzon is to make it to tomorrow. But thank God we don't have to think about, we're not hopefully worried that there's not going to be lunch tomorrow. So we can daydream about other things. But Hashem's essential Ratzon never changes. Our manifest Ratzon may change because we change. So when you're little, you want a toy. When you're older, you want something more sophisticated and so on. But that's not truly what we mean by Ratzon. Ratzon is not just some sort of momentary interest or indulgence. So this is what the Alter Rebbe is talking about here, that mitzvahs are the Ratzon. And that Ratzon is hard to know. We just know what we want. And every parent goes through this, when the child comes home and he says, I'm never going to school again. So that's what it's presenting itself. But the parent understands that their Ratzon is that they don't have friends, or they had a bad experience, or whatever it was. There's something deeper going on than simply the manifestation. And again, a child could have a disconnect between their true Ratzon and their request. Hashem doesn't have a disconnect between his true Ratzon and his request. His request is truly what he wants. That is his true Ratzon. And it's higher than, and again, we say higher, we mean more personal than even the level of Chachma, even Hashem's Chachma. And this is the sort of disconcerting point that the Alter Rebbe is making here. And that's what it means that the Eishes Chayla Teres Baila, the woman of valor is the crown of her husband. She draws out something that's otherwise not immediately obvious. And this is the illustration. The husband brings home the wheat and the wife turns the wheat into bread. This is the idea of the creation of a child and so on. Torah, the written Torah, is the contribution of the raw material, and the oral Torah draws out and exhumes the depth that is otherwise contained within the within the written law, which is protected, so to speak. And then it's developed through that level of trust. It's one of the explanations as to why the Yidden had to go through the Mitzrayim experience, the Egypt experience, before we could get the Torah. Because Hashem wants to see, are you really in? And even when we get to Har Sinai, we have the whole negotiation where we say, Hashem says, how do I know that this will be sustained and 3,500 years from now, you'll still be talking Torah? And ultimately we pledged our children, because trusting is difficult, because once you trust, you could be harmed. If I trust you with something, I could be harmed. Zehu back in b'chol hashena halachas b'chol yom, and this is a reference. You may recognize it. We say it in the davening just before Aleinu. Whoever learns law halacha every day is assured of a place in the world to come. So the Alter Rebbe is saying, why is it specifically whoever learns halacha? We have all kinds of things we could learn. You could learn the Chumash, you could learn Medrash. A lot of Torah study is not geared towards any pragmatic halacha. Even within halachas, there are halachas that I may never encounter. There's situational halachas, the halachas for farmers, halachas if you live in Eretz Yisrael, if you don't live in Eretz Yisrael, if you're a sofer, how to write a Torah, and so on. Because it's not just about the pragmatic execution of the rules. It's that when we learn halacha, let me back up a second. The statement is, whoever studies halacha is assured of having a place in the world to come. The question is, what's the cause effect here? Why is it that if I learn halacha, I'll have a place in the world to come? It doesn't say if you learn Torah in general, or if you do mitzvahs in general. What is it specifically about studying halacha that assures me a place in the world to come? But now, hopefully we understand what this means. When we study halacha, what we're doing is we're fleshing out the depth of Hashem's desire, Hashem's ratzon. We're fleshing out Hashem. So when we do that, that means I want to get to know you. So why is it that if I ask questions, they say the best conversationalist is the one who listens the most. Why is it that if I show an interest within the other person, we effectuate a closeness between them just because he shared with me his interests? Because I was receptive enough, or I would say I was interested enough in knowing who he truly is. I truly wanted to get to know him. Now, again, we've all probably been in both experiences, meaning if you go to the doctor and the doctor asks you how you're feeling, none of your business. Meaning if I'm not willing to share, then he's not going to be able to help me. But when I go into somebody who's less than honest, and he starts asking me questions, he may be trying to take advantage of me, manipulate me into buying something I don't want to buy, scare me, et cetera, et cetera. So when we study halacha, what we're saying is, Hashem, you are important to me. I want to know about what is important to you. So, whenever your friend, your spouse, your child, your neighbor shares with you something that is important to them, even though the subject is completely unimportant to me, the fact that it's important to them means that I want to know about it. Why is this important to you? What is it that is important about it? How is it important? And so on. Not in an inquisition manner, like, why would I care about that? But help me understand you. So now we see the cause effect. When I study halacha, in other words, when I pursue what is truly the passion of Hashem, when I pursue that, I become aligned with Hashem. Olam haba, world to come, is where I am totally aligned with Hashem. As we've talked about before, the world to come is not just where I get all the stuff I didn't get when I was here. If I behaved myself while I was in this world, I'll get to have all those indulgences that I passed up on in heaven, where I get to eat chocolate and never get cavities. But it means that I become absolutely aligned with the oneness of Hashem. And why? Because I pursue it with the study of halacha is about the pursuit of the will of Hashem. And this just adds why every once in a while you get a halacha that seems to make no sense at all. It's a total deviation from, like, we're going 2, 4, 6 potato. Where did that come from? Because we should never forget that halacha is ultimately the will of Hashem. And just like my interests and desires don't always make perfect logical sense, sometimes I get a little goofy. And again, we are subject to whims and so on. Hashem is not. But it's sort of like we would say, keeps you honest that that you remember that all the halachas and all the rules are ultimately the will of Hashem. And you have this commonly, in things that we don't think about because we're just doing it, the laws of muksa and so on. A lot of these nuanced laws, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make sense. Okay. This is what we mean. She girds her loins with strength, whatever girding means, meaning that's like this strength, this idea that we strengthen our amunah. It's an effort to strengthen our amunah. Ein oiz ela Torah. And what will strengthen it is Torah study, which again, in a certain oddity, appears or could be seen as a contradiction to amunah. And this is a common theme that we've seen. We saw it in Iggeres Tshuva, where Torah study supports davening, which supports tshuva. They're not, like my new word is, silos. It's not like I'm doing my Torah study. Okay, stop that. Now do davening. Okay, stop that. Now do tshuva. One enriches the other. How does Torah study enrich my amunah? It would almost seem to be the opposite. In Torah study, we have to be academic and we have to be totally rigid, and like all of those stories where Hashem tries to sort of mix in and we say, hey, Hashem, we make the decisions down here. You've entrusted the Torah to us, and to human logic and miracles play no role. Again, because what is the objective? We find it interesting, again, I don't know whatever the word is, the Gemara speculates, why, as we also fall into, why do bad things happen? We speculate. So we say, why was the Beis Hamikdash destroyed? Because of baseless hatred. People are familiar with this idea. There's another speculation why the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. And they say because people did not make the bracha for Torah study before learning Torah. So we say, wow, okay, but that seems pretty harsh. What? So we explain, it's not just that they forgot to mumble the bracha, Asher Kedishanu al Divrei Torah. It's that people forgot that Torah study was about being connected with Hashem. We forget, we think it's genius and brilliant and exciting and interesting, and it becomes academic detachment and so on. There is such a phenomenon. People love academia. They could become Torah academics, and they reduce Torah, or they confine Torah, reduce is unfair, they confine Torah to the world of academia. And they're brilliant and geniuses, just like people are brilliant physicists and people are brilliant scholars of Shakespeare and so on. There are people who are brilliant scholars of Torah, and yet they don't make the bracha. They don't see the godliness that's contained within Torah. And if we, chas v'shalom, allow that connection to be snapped, then we are not connected to the Ratzon of Hashem. And now Torah is one intellect, the Iliad and Aristotle, that's another one, and then it's a debate. Whose is better? But it's lost the essential connection. Okay, so how do we support it with Torah? That Torah gives us this strength to our amunah, that is, we can actively strengthen our amunah, as we talked about. And it will strengthen the arms. What are the arms? Again, following this, the physical body as the metaphor. The thighs are the basis. The intellect is the head. Higher than the intellect is the rutzai. And now we've introduced the arms. What is the mashal of the arms? The chilu v'rechimu. The love, or the reverence better, and the love. Again, reminder that love is the desire to be close, and reverence is the sense of distance. So again, we use the concept of tzaddikim. They always used to use the mashal of kings, but unfortunately, in our experience, we don't revere kings. We just see them as self-serving and so on. But the person longs for this sense to be close. But then as they get close, they have the sense of distance. Just to use an illustration from our life experience, when Rebbetzin Chaim Mushka passed away, there was this whole upside down inversion. All of a sudden, the Hasidim are going into the Rebbe's house, which was never, and you're paying a shiva call. There's the Rebbe, sitting on the low stool, and so you're going right past the Rebbe. You've never been in that kind of proximity. So there's this great desire, and then there's this great sense of awe. And there was this whole debate: you should go, you shouldn't go. Who are you to go? You should go, you shouldn't go. We didn't know what to do. Even the whole idea of the Rebbe giving kashal bracha and what we call dollars and so on, it was a closeness. And I mean, just to add, for women was like unheard of. This is like unprecedented, that women would go right up there like that. It was unimaginable. I mean, that was a total revolution that women would do that. They'd go right up to the Rebbe like that for dollars for my marim, etc. It was unheard of. So there's a closeness and a distance, So there's two types of closeness and distance. One is sichliim. Again, you remember this from the Sefer Shalbeinim, long, short way, that we develop the intellectual understanding of our desire to be close with Hashem and our sense of awe and being awed by the infinity of Hashem. And then there's the tiviim. Then there's the natural. Everybody has it. It's part of our natural makeup. That we have an aspect of Hashem embedded within us, and just as a child longs to be close with his parent, we long to be close with Hashem. Now, in the Sefer Shalbeinim, we always emphasized that the sichliim, the intellectually developed love and fear of Hashem, was a greater, more profound level of godliness than just the natural, because the natural is what you're born with. And yes, you have to keep it going because, like anything else that a person is born with, if they don't exercise it, it atrophies. And naturally, the world is constantly beating down against our love of Hashem. So the fact that I can maintain my natural love of Hashem is an accomplishment that shouldn't be seen as somehow less than. And our aspiration is to develop, again, the long, short way, an intellectually supported, nourished, and nurtured level of godliness. So you recall this from the Sefer Shalbeinim. But here the Alter Rebbe flips it. You see, he first mentions the sichliim, the intellectually developed. Then he mentions the tiviim, the natural level. Why? Because here we're shooting for the expression of the full-on nature. That is not just that I'm riding out my natural ability, like a person has a natural ability and they get by with the minimal amount of effort because they're naturally skilled at it, whether it's music or athletics or art or whatever it is. A person has a certain capacity. They exert just enough effort to not get yelled at, and they stumble through life. And then we're saying, no, you got to use your intellect to develop your natural skills. But here the Alter Rebbe is flipping it. And he's first talking about the intellectually developed. And then he's saying, no, but what we're ultimately shooting for is that essential natural love that can be even more, I'm going to say more infinite, I don't know if that's even a word, more expressive of my closeness with Hashem, even more than the sichli, than the intellectually developed. Each person based on their own level. Those who can do it with the natural love, those who can do it with the intellectually generated love, and then that even greater level. And this is that constant back and forth and back and forth. And the parentheses, and again, where it's not one to the exclusion of the other, what stands up and gives that the head, what holds the head up, is the intellect that we engage. We say, Tama ki tov sachar, we have tasted and that her wares are valuable. Again, you recognize this from the Eshes Chayil, meaning we have the intellectual, which is compared to tam, to taste. The same word for tasty is the same word for intellectual, because they both give you that pleasure. Food that tastes good is like understanding something, which holds up the intellect, the head. However, when are we going to find this level strengthen? What's going to give us, what's our opportunity to do this is, and this is a little bit ironic, Shas Tfilas HaShachar, morning davening. Say davening, what does davening have to do with the intellect? Well, again, we're breaking down this parallel lines, and we're understanding the interplay between them, because they are all in the service of Hashem. We understand this in life in general, parenting and so on. The parent has to do the carpool and the math homework and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and so on. And all of those, what's the word I'm looking for? Chores are all driven from the same thing. You know, again, we're trying to overcome. Even in factories, they talk about this, you know, that they realized this was the problem. People just turning widgets all day. They had no understanding of the general picture. And if you move them around from doing this for 2 hours and this for 2 hours and this for 2 hours, they understood what they're doing, and therefore they invested themselves in it. So too, all of our aspects are aligned with the same ultimate objective, which is the release of the essence of our neshama, not to be confined by the intellect. Davening time, and again, we talked about this. I mean, this is a halacha that affects men more than women because of the obligation to daven within a certain time. That when we daven, those are the itim mizumanim, those designated times where we get the opportunity to get outside of ourselves. And hopefully we experience this. And the Alter Rebbe acknowledges that it's not so easy. That we're davening, but we still have half an eye on our watch because we have to be places and we have to run and go and so on. People have to punch clocks. You know, it's rough. There's a story told about when the Mittler Rebbe was still in the lifetime of his father. He reprimanded this certain chassid, you know, for running out the door, and the guy got impatient, and he said, "What do you know? You know, you sit here in the yeshiva all day. I have to go and I have to deal with all these people, and I get there and they drink and they're foul mouthed, and I have to deal with it, and I have to catch them at a certain time." You know, and the Alter Rebbe called him in, and the guy was like, "Oh no, you know, I'm in trouble." And he said to him something of lines like, "Thank you for making my son a chassid." You know, there's real struggles, which the Alter Rebbe acknowledges. The people are, you know, they're rushing to this and that and all kinds of life obligations. But that's a great opportunity, which again, as the Yetzer Hara knows that. That's why amongst Hasidim, they would say, how do you know what your personal mission is in life? So we'd say 2 ways. One is the thing that really goes well for you. That's your thing. Or the thing that's really hard for you, because the Yetzer Hara knows that that's your thing. Okay, thanks a lot. What is your thing? The thing that you're really good at and the thing that you're really bad at. Oh, okay, thanks. This, therefore, is what I ask of those who truly seek Hashem. You remember the very beginning of this letter, the Alter Rebbe acknowledged the communal Torah study, where everybody took a volume of the Talmud. It's a practice that we do to this day. Everybody in a community, like a big community like there, everyone takes a volume, and collectively we finish the whole Talmud in 1 year. We commonly do it on Yutas Kislev as part of the celebration. Lios was a current Nehem, that it should be reminded between your eyes, and you recognize that idea. It's like, you know, the idea of like the tefillin, it's a sign there. Everything that I wrote to you about this in general. Ubefrat, and particularly, when it talks about davening. And in Hayom Yom, it says that davening is the key to everything. When davening becomes rote and unexpressive and unmeaningful and cold, everything sort of atrophies therefrom. And this is a challenge that we're still dealing with. You know, Hasidim held in great esteem the people who would daven for hours and massage every word and nuance and so on. It's hard. It's a hard thing to keep our minds focused that way. Yom Yidushun Hashem b'chol liban. Every day that we should seek Hashem with all of our heart. Ubechol nafsham, and all of our soul. The nafsham tishtapech kemayim noichech b'nei Hashem, and our souls should pour out in this desire for Hashem. Again, this is also a reference to a letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote, which is also incorporated here in the Iggeres HaKodesh in letter 29, where the Alter Rebbe gives some very specific recommendations for davening, that everybody should be on the same page and they should read it in unison, and they shouldn't be sort of wandering around, and certainly not engaging in idle chit-chat, or this guy's reading this page, that guy's reading the other page. And these are hard things. It's challenging for people to be on task and go with it, and page after page after page. It's challenging. The Yetzer Hara gets mixed in. All kinds of our struggles go on. But again, this is what we mean with the idea of avodas hatfila. It's a labor. It's not just about reading the words and pronouncing them properly and thinking about their meaning, of course, and then this transformative experience. And again, just like the letter began with the request or gratitude, better, for the communal learning, it's going to conclude here with some directives about communal davening. Now, this third part of the letter, which we're going to read now, was written much later, after the first part that we read last week was written in 1764. The part which we just completed now was written about a year and a half later. And this one was written also a number of years afterwards. Vata apam, and now Hineni Yosef Shenis, I add on again, Betoisvis Beer, with greater explanation, Ubakash and request, Kfula, Shtucho Frusha, I'm laying it out clear as I can be. How can I make it any more obvious? If they call Anshe Shloimim, in front of all of the people of our community, that's the term Anash. We hear that term Anash, that's what this is. It's a combo of these two words, Anshe Shloimim, HaKroivim, those who are close, Varachaikim, and those who consider themselves far. Lakayim Aleim, to fulfill the following rule. To call Yom HaChol, all weekdays. Lo Yard Lifnei HaTevo, do not have a person lead the davening who is Abali Eskim, Shein Lehem Pnai Kol Kach. And the Alter Rebbe is recognizing people who have to go to work and they don't have enough time. Now, there is a great emphasis on davening with a minyan, halachically, spiritually. There's a great emphasis on davening from the very beginning to the end with the minyan. But at certain points, we got to make a somewhat of an adjustment. Is it better to daven with the minyan, but to have to therefore go rushed because people need to go and you're not going to have a minyan? People need to run out. Or is it better to daven slowly and you won't have a minyan? You know, when someone is chas v'sholom, there's mourning and a person is saying Kaddish, he wants to say all the Kaddish, but he's davening too slow. People are going to leave. Maybe it's a greater covet for the person he's saying Kaddish for. They should daven slower. These are ongoing challenges, nothing new under the sun. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe recommends during the weekdays, don't have someone lead the davening who's in a hurry. And people, he's not delegitimizing that people are in a hurry, but don't have that guy lead the davening. Rak oisim sheish lem pnai, people who have more time. Or malamdim, or the school teachers, or smuchim al shulchan aviyam, those who, other people, literally, their father takes care of them. Shechem laharach b'tfilas hashachar, who can go at length, erech shao mechsa, lepachas, at least an hour and a half. Now, I can tell you, I maybe in the yeshivas they can daven like this, but I have not been in a shul that people daven shachris on a weekday for an hour and a half. I don't know, whatever it is, we do it's our struggles. Now, curiously, in the Gemara, it talks about what they call the early Hasidim, not Hasidim the way we use the term, that they would daven for an hour. So it was an hour, so is there an hour and a half? No, that was just the Amida they daven for an hour. An hour and a half is the whole davening. Okay. Call your Meisachol on weekdays. So people who can daven for an hour and a half, they should lead the davening on the weekdays. Now, this is not only something that the Alter Rebbe writes here in Tanya, he writes it in Shulchan Aruch too. In the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he goes through in detail that Shabbos and Yontif is when the people have time, and therefore they shouldn't spend their time just eating and drinking and sleeping. They should spend their time davening. And again, I can tell you from my friends whose parents came from Russia, from that generation, this is what they talked about. They had all kinds of crazy Mesiras Nefesh not to go to work on Shabbos. and all kinds of threats and hardships, not so they could stay and shluf on Shabbos. And, again, this is not my personal life experience, but the parents of my contemporaries, they all knew the whole davening by heart because they didn't have Siddurim. And they said that's all they did on Shabbos in Russia. They davened all day. They didn't, sleep late and eat cholent and so on, because they understood they weren't fighting the communist bear just to sleep late on Saturday morning. Again, it's a challenge. So how do we determine who should daven? Either just do a lottery system, or whoever everybody chooses, and the person should daven slowly and methodically. And again, this is weekdays, an hour and a half. And again, I am not familiar with a shul that's up to this level. And he should be surrounded by teachers or people who, again, their parents are supporting them, people who have the time to do it. And absolutely not ever deviate from it. And we have letter after letter from the Rebbeim about davening. And again, I don't want to ever say they gave up, but it's hard. Even when the Rebbe was davening, after when he had Yahrzeit for his parents, for the Frierdiker Rebbe, when the Rebbe Chaim Mushka passed away and the Rebbe led the davening, I don't believe it took an hour and a half from Hoidu till the end. Again, you could watch the videotapes. And the Rebbe led the davening, and I don't believe it took an hour and a half. However, b'Shabbos Yomim Tovim, shegam kol bali eskim yesh lem pnai b'shas HaKodesh laharak v'tfilosim v'kavanas livam v'nafshel Hashem. When it's Shabbos and Yom Tov, that even people who are otherwise constantly engaged in their work, and they also have this extra time, they also have this free time that they can. And what does a Jew want to do with his free time? He wants to daven. He wants to spend that deep time with Hashem. He wants to daven at great length. Then they should take even more of a responsibility and more of an opportunity. Like it says in Shulchan Aruch, as I mentioned to you before. If you want to look it up, I made a note. It's chapter 290, subchapter 5. Like it says in the Torah, in the written Torah in Moshe, 6 days you shall work. The Yom HaShvi, and the seventh day is Shabbos la Hashem Elokecha. Shabbos is for Hashem. Daika Kulul Hashem, it's for Hashem entirely. Even though everybody understands that you have to eat on Shabbos, you're not allowed to fast, but Shabbos is for Hashem. And I told the story before, when I was a bacher, I used to go to this family, for Shabbos meals, and they told the story. The woman, can I know her? They have a big family. So they would bring in these speakers like we do. So they bring in a frum woman from Borough Park, a Chassidish woman, who has also 10 kids. And she's going to talk to them about raising large families. And she said, on Shabbos, you should encourage your husband to go over the Parsha and not to read the Jewish press and not to lie down on the couch. And all these women from Crown Heights, there's not total disconnect. And this was, she can't figure out why she's a frum woman, Chassidish woman from a community. Why is this not resonating? So finally, one of the women decided to put her out of her misery. And she said, let me explain to you what it's like here. The Rebbe's Farbrengen begins at 1:30. So if you live within the 2 blocks of 770, so your husband and your sons bring all their friends to your house after davening to make Kiddush and eat something before they all go to the Farbrengen. If not, then your husband and sons are not coming home at all. They go to daven. They go to the Farbrengen. This, I remember, was not uncommon. The Farbrengen went till after Shabbos, certainly in the winter. It would go till after Shabbos, daven Mincha Ma'ariv, come home, make Havdalah, and have cholent from Eleva Malka. And this idea that you spend Shabbos afternoon sitting on the couch, okay, it's been 30 years, but it was not an idea. There's no such thing. The whole Shabbos, you're in 770. You get there early to when the Rebbe comes in for davening, and you stay till after davening. Maybe, like I said, you go to a friend's house for Kiddush, and then you spend the whole day at the Farbrengen. Because it's Shabbos la Hashem. The Shabbos is for Hashem, and that's where. So again, the Alter Rebbe is calling upon him now. You'll see here how insistent the Alter Rebbe is. And therefore, so therefore, the person who was during the week rushing out, he truly cherishes that Shabbos and Yontif opportunity for him to daven. He should lead the davening. Now, ironically, we just had it in Chabad on the Shalosh Regalim, on the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Other communities read one of the 5 Megillas. On Shavuos, they read Rus. On Sukkot, they read Koheles. And on Pesach, they read Shir Hashirim. But we don't in Chabad. And we don't read Akdomus either. We're not against it, but it's not. And one of the reasons is, it takes too long. Quite literally. It's, so I don't know. I don't have the answer for you. Why it is that we seem to be so impatient. When people find out that we start davening 10 o'clock, and on Yom Kippur too, 10 o'clock, and you have a break. In other shuls, they start at 8 o'clock, and they don't break the whole day. There's no break. They go straight through. Shachris, Musaf, Mincha, Nila, all the way to the end. You start at 10, and you have an hour break? Okay, look, I don't know. We're going da. Look what the Alter Rebbe says here. I am letting you know. It is my intention in Mitzvah Hashem. I'm sending out to all of the different minions, Meraglim, spies, Beseisa, and you won't know. Later to know, Leiti, and to let me know. Call me Efshalai. Everybody who had the opportunity to daven. And he had the time, he wasn't rushing out to punch a clock, and he could have spent his time engaged in in-depth davening. And he was being essentially lazy about it. We're going to basically punish him. We're going to make a judgment. We're not going to let him come, because in order to leave wherever you lived, which was a big journey, and come to the Alter Rebbe, you needed to get permission. I'm going to push him away with both hands. And he wants to come here to hear and learn Chassidus. I don't know if this happened. I don't have any reports. If the Alter Rebbe, in fact, said, no, that guy, we got a note on you, and so on. I don't know. Now, look, we do know that this is what goes on in General Motors and IBM, right? If you don't show up to work, you can't show up to get paid. They keep tabs on what you do. It may feel a little too corporate for Kedusha, but this is what the Alter Rebbe says. And again, I have no record of whether this actually happened, didn't happen. I don't know. And from the negative, you can infer the positive. If you're davening, this is what we want. This is what it means to come close in here and learn Chassidus. And those who will hear it will be pleasurable for them, and blessings will come upon them with good. And what is good? Good is the good of Torah. So here again, the Alter Rebbe concludes with the significance about davening, and about davening communally, and about how davening enriches everything, and it becomes the premise by which our faith is enriched, our chachma, our intellect is enriched, and ultimately to reach this level of Ratzon.